Testing? Testing, yeah.
Testing, can you hear me now? Perfect.
Say something.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. If you could take your seats, we're going to get started in about 10 seconds. So, thank you, good evening, and welcome to this, the first seminar for the 49th annual meeting of the Board of Governors of the Caribbean Development Bank. Agriculture, let's embrace the opportunities. And I promise you that we will have quite an exciting and engaging conversation here this evening with our distinguished panel. But before we do that, I ask you to just sit back and enjoy a short video which will help us frame the conversation this afternoon. In 2020, the Caribbean Development Bank will be celebrating 50 years of service to the region. From inception, we identified the agricultural sector as one of the priorities for our borrowing member countries. Whilst the structure of the sector has changed over the past decades, we remain convinced that it can continue to play an integral role in the development of our region. With that in mind, we have commenced the process of revising our agricultural sector policy and strategy. We are seeking to ensure that our interventions in the sector remain relevant, that they have the capacity to drive the development of a competitive, inclusive, and sustainable agri-food system in our region. The process of developing the strategy involves consultation with stakeholders across the region, particularly our farmers. So we have reached out to some of them to have them share their experiences.
Yeah, in agriculture about 14 years old. I've been in school, you know, and that was all. That is my passion. Well, I get it from my parents. Yeah, I come see my father and my mother doing agriculture. So you know, it's in his blood, you know. I love it. If we didn't have the water to push it more, but that's why I don't have anything substantial right now, because no water, you know, and the irrigation is tough.
The weather condition gets worse, or rainy time becomes our dry time. You just can't predict the weather again. I use drip irrigation, and drip irrigation helps us to maintain the little water that we have.
My name is Christina Adams. I am the manager at Adams Aquafarm Limited. We are a tilapia farm in Barbados. We do aquaculture and aquaponics. I have been in agriculture since 2006 when I first started to play with the idea of doing tilapia farming, but it was not until 2013 that I actually took the leap and started my own commercial farm. My operation uses quite a bit of technology. The main reason that I use this technology first of all, is more to be sustainable. I really believe that for farming to succeed on a small island, one of your main focuses has to be the sustainability of your business. So the technology allows me to conserve things like my electricity bill, my water usage. Even though technology is expensive, overall from a business point of view, it will save me money in the long term. It also makes me more compliant with a lot of regulations and standards, so I can ensure that my business can go forward. And then of course my personal favorite for using the technology is it makes my job exciting. I get to do more fun things like water quality testing and feeding charts and growth rates, and take the farming to a more modern level.
I started off in agriculture. Firstly, I started exporting, like melangens, hot pepper, pumpkin mainly. But that market get non-profitable now. And I turned to local market where I produce, someone come home, farm gate, buy the goods, and they sell in the market because it's too much for one person to produce and go in the market and sell. We employ more machinery in our work because of the fact that labor is a problem in Trinidad. We deal with the more unskilled labor, so it's more like a tuition on a daily basis. You have to show them what you need, In Trinidad, once a laborer is skilled, they look for either construction or some more highly paid job. So we cut the manual labor by, let me say, 75% with machinery. We do everything that is more management rather than laborers' work. I look forward in staying in agriculture because it's a peaceful work. Overall, it's a very peaceful work.
So, ladies and gentlemen, as was just heard in the video, we're in the process of updating our agriculture policy and strategy, and we have commissioned a study to look at the state of agriculture in our region, and then to, of course, determine how we respond. It is therefore my distinct pleasure to invite to the podium to do a short presentation for you on exactly how CDB is treating, what the study actually turned up, and how we are responding. A man who has worked tirelessly not only on this project, but in agriculture across the region and even extra-regionally, our senior agricultural specialist at the bank, Mr. Luther Saintville. Luther.
Sorry, I thought I could do a little bit of the fashion show, continue. There were no males, in the fashion show. So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for coming. In 2000, the estimate was 2.1 billion United States dollars. By the end of last year, 2018, we were just under 5 billion US dollars. I'm referring here to the food import bill for the region, which has more than doubled over the past 2 decades. As it currently stands, 60% of the food imported in the region, consumed in the region, is imported. In some countries, that figure is as high as 80%. Only 2 countries, Belize and Guyana, produce more than 50% of the food that they consume. 40% of our food imports come from a single source. I'm well aware of the fact that imported foods tend to be cheaper than locally produced alternatives. On the other hand, imported foods tend to be highly processed, calorie dense, high in fats and sweeteners. And these are the very factors that are driving the increase in non-communicable diseases in our region. And if the answer is yes, factor in the loss to productivity, the cost of treating with NCDs, how cheap is our imported food? I trust we can have a debate on that at some later stage. Today, I'll continue on the more substantive issues as it relates to agriculture and production. So looking globally, where do we stand? We see that the agricultural food supply system is vulnerable to supply and price swings. We see demand for food is projected to increase by at least 60% by 2050. Some estimates put that figure much higher, 70, and some even 90%. On the other hand, as we witnessed during the 2007-2008 food crisis, production can be negatively impacted by a range of events, including climate change and unpredictable increases in the price of fuel. It's against this background that we at CDB embarked on the process of revising our agricultural sector strategy and policy paper. Part of the process involves, in partnership with FAO, the development of a study on the state of agriculture in the Caribbean. Over the next few minutes, I would like to share with you the main findings from the study and CDB's proposal for transforming our agricultural sector. Firstly, how is agriculture performing? It's no surprise to us that in the majority of our BMCs, the contribution of agriculture to GDP is marginal. In 4 BMCs, it contributes 12 to 17% of GDP. The contribution to employment tends to be a bit higher, up to 50% in Haiti. Most of the BMCs where agriculture contributes marginally to GDP tend to be highly dependent on food imports. So is there a case, I'm sure there is, for increasing intra-regional trade in the sector? That is one of the questions I hope we have a chance to debate as we proceed this evening. What about the trends in the agricultural sector? Very familiar to us that we've moved away from the export of our traditional products. What has taken the space of that, not in terms of value, but in terms of the proportion of agri-food exports, is agro-processing. Across the region, since 2000, we have seen an increase in fruit and vegetable production in the islands, legumes, cereals in some of the continental states. We've also seen large increases in the production of poultry, cattle, and small ruminants. And I must mention that while sugar and bananas are no longer as important as they used to be in the 90s, they still remain to be crops of significance to the countries that are still engaged in the production and export. But on the whole, the main conclusion of the study is that this sector is underperforming. And these are the reasons why, the key reasons. There are several, but for the purposes of this discussion, I've decided to categorize them as follows: low productivity growth, weak market linkages, vulnerable to natural hazard events and climate change, and of course, poverty and inequality. Over the next few slides, I will go through these challenges individually. I was thinking that this slide says it all. That's where the region is, and that's where North America is, where we get most of our food from. What's the reason? Technology, technology, technology. Countries that have invested heavy in technology have seen rapid increases in productivity growth. We in the Caribbean, over the last several years, we are stuck somewhere, not at the bottom, but close to the bottom. I think that is significant for us because I think it tells us quite a bit that if we are to move the sector forward, we have to embrace technology. There can be no transformation without embracing technology. Weak market linkages. We've often discussed the challenges related to connectivity, low shipping links between the region and extra-regional markets, and even intra-regionally, we do face challenges with shipping. Today, I would like to focus on something that is kind of emerging, which is the area of the growth of food safety standards. Essentially, the region is lagging behind, largely on account of an increase in the incidence of foodborne illnesses, and the fact that most of us purchase our fruits, our agricultural products from supermarkets, and a lot of our products are targeted towards the tourism industry. We have to pay a lot more attention to the issue of food safety. This letter, which I hope you can read, is basically a letter, an extract from a letter from the USDA to one of our BMCs, indicating that within the framework of legislation governing the export of food to the US, they were going to undertake an audit of the facilities in that BMC. You will note somewhere it says in the letter that if we do not, in my own words, if we do not hear from you, it's because we know you are hiding away from us, because we have sent that message we're sure you've received it, essentially. I was fortunate enough to be present when that audit was being undertaken, and I recall how detailed it was. I recall we were in the pack house, and there was a little whistle somewhere in the roof of the pack house. There was a bird in the pack house. The auditor, he continued walking, and I said, why did that bird, why did she have to enter, sorry, why did he have, sorry, why did it have to come at the pack house at that particular time? But the inspector seemed unfazed until we sat in the afternoon and he started to go through his list of non-compliance issues. The first one, there was a bird in the pack house. So I think essentially, if we are to be compliant with food safety standards that are increasingly becoming relevant for trade in the sector, we have to treat this thing more seriously. As far as exports goes, 20% of our exports are to the US. If we do not treat with that matter, then possibly there could be a risk in terms of sustaining those exports. Natural hazards and climate change. I'm from Dominica, and I'm sure most of you, every one of us would know what happens during a hurricane. So I will skip the discussion on hurricanes. But what about droughts? 40% of the region is impacted by mild droughts annually, and 10% by severe droughts. On the other hand, less than 5% of our farmers have access to irrigation. The dry season runs, as we all know, at the beginning to the middle of the year. The tourist season, when there are the most mouths to feed, runs from the end of the year, end of October, to April. So in essence, when there are the most mouths to feed, our farmers face significant challenges in producing. We cannot continue with business as is. Incidentally, I like to refer to droughts as the second silent killer in the agricultural sector, because the farmers tend to suffer in silence. When there's a hurricane, the eyes of the world, we all focus on this, floods, etc. Droughts, they tend to go, in a lot of instances, unnoticed. So, as a result of these challenges, it's no surprise that we have high levels of poverty and inequality in the sector. In general, agriculture is concentrated in rural areas. Rural residents generally have few opportunities outside of the sector. And as a result, the failings of the agriculture sector weigh heavily on our rural residents. And of course, what happens in the rural space will ultimately find its way into cities. So in essence, we are all suffering because of the low productivity and weak market linkages in the agricultural sector. But it's not all doom and gloom. Over the course of this study, we've identified several farmers who were operating on the cutting edge, who were embracing technology, who were implementing standards required by the market. So we remain optimistic. And it's for that reason we've decided to shape our agricultural sector policy in a manner that it will respond to the challenges facing the sector. We believe that the agricultural sector is the most efficient way to reduce poverty in rural areas. We believe that we need to focus on farmers who have the capacity to move up to the next level, to engage in commercial activities. We are no way suggesting that we will ignore persons who operate on a subsistence level. We will seek to move those up, and in some instances, we have to be honest with ourselves. Man with 2-yard fowls isn't a farmer, and then we may have to look for opportunities outside of the agricultural sector to give him a decent quality of life. How? We have to embrace technology, as I've said already. And if we do all that, then we come towards the theme of this entire board meeting, transformation. We, I think, can transform the agricultural sector. To do so, we have to focus on value chains, strengthening value chains, because the farmer does not operate in isolation. Input suppliers, service providers, traders, processors, and the functions and actions of all actors in the value chain impacts the farmer. We must build resilience to climate change, and we must embrace the cross-cutting themes of gender equality, ensuring safe and nutritious foods for our consumers, and providing an opportunity within the sector for the thousands of youth who graduate from our schools and universities every year. Our goal is to achieve a more competitive, inclusive, and sustainable agri-food system. To be more competitive, we need higher productivity and stronger market linkages. To be more inclusive, we need more and more reliable incomes for the persons who depend on the sector. To be more sustainable, we need more efficient use of resources. We need stronger institutions, both nationally and regionally. We recognize that some problems are best dealt with on a regional basis. For example, R&D, because the cost for research is relatively high, and individual countries may not be able to undertake that level of research required to drive the sector forward on a stand-alone basis. Food safety standards, laboratory testing facilities. We need not focus on each country having its own, but through organizations such as CAFSA that we have built for ourselves, we can continue to strengthen food safety legislation and systems across the region. And of course, we must focus on infrastructure, production, market access, production, roads that generally in a state of disrepair, the absence of cold storage facilities, high levels of wastage and loss, upwards of 40% for many farmers. And of course, pack houses to ensure compliance with emerging food safety standards. Ladies and gentlemen, we can transform the agricultural sector because there's evidence already in our region of farmers operating on the cutting edge. And if we are serious about reducing poverty in our region, about addressing inequality, about addressing the incidence of non-communicable diseases, we must embrace the opportunities within the agricultural sector. Thank you.
Good job. Not again over here. Good job. Thank you so much, Luther. It just dawned on me that I didn't introduce myself earlier. My name is Daniel Best. I'm the Director of the projects at the Caribbean Development Bank. And as I promised you, we have quite an exciting panel here this evening. I'm going to introduce our panelists individually, and as I introduce them, they'll come forward and join me here on the platform. Mr. Barton Clark is the Executive Director of the Caribbean Agricultural Research and Development Institute. He was appointed to that position in 2015. Mr. Clark has a wealth of professional experience in agricultural development and a deep understanding and knowledge of the region's political and socio-economic systems. Mr. Barton Clark. Ms. Nirmala Debbie Singh Persad, CEO of the National Agricultural Marketing and Development Corporation, NAMDEVCO, right here in Trinidad, has been employed with the corporation for 14 years, having first come on board as a food technologist. She brought to the organization a BSc in Nutrition and Dietetics and an MSc in Tropical Commodity Utilization from the great St. Augustine campus of the University of the West Indies. I put in the great part. But I'm sure some of you agree with that. Nirmala. Mr. Jose Alpuche is currently Chief Executive Officer in the Ministry of Agriculture of Belize since March of 2012. Prior to this, he was a founding member and served as CEO of the Belize Agro-Productive Sector Group, an industry-owned not-for-profit company that coordinates the collective interests of Belize's major commodities, including citrus, sugar, livestock, and grains. Jose. And last and by no means least, Ms. Christina Adams is an aquaculture consultant who owns and manages an aquaculture farm that produces tilapia and crayfish. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Guelph in Canada and a master's degree in Marine and Coastal Management from the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus. So this is our panel for this evening. The only set of marching orders I gave the panel is that we should have a robust and perhaps muscular discussion this evening, because this is one of the topics that could evoke quite a bit of emotions. So I'm going to jump right in. Panelists, CDB is seeking to support its member states in the development of a more competitive, inclusive, and sustainable agri-food system. What are the most critical changes that we must make to achieve this objective? And I happen to know that, well, I know two of you very well, that you are not politically correct in any way. So don't worry about offending CDB or any persons here. Tell us what critical changes we must make as a bank to support a more sustainable and inclusive agri-food process. Barton, I know you want to start. Just go ahead. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, people. Thanks for the opportunity and so on to share with you this afternoon regarding what CDB should do. Well, firstly, CDB ought to adopt, as Luther says, a value chain approach towards its work in the agricultural sector. It is not only about investments in production or investments in processing, but indeed and so on, it needs to look at the entire value chain. It also needs, to my mind, to make some consideration. If you go back to the need for, at least the heads of government speak, that there's a CARICOM strategic plan that speaks to agriculture as a vehicle for social and economic enfranchisement, and with the objective of making a food secure in the Caribbean. Luther alluded to the numbers and the matrix with respect and things to importation and so on of food. But the reality is that we need to look at this whole issue of cross-border investments, where we do strategic investments within those which have large land masses to allow us to be able to meet these needs. And those needs are not related to primary production issues only. The fact of the matter is that we really can continue to tell people and so on that they must eat more cassava when they are accustomed now to eating certain kinds of foods in certain forms. So therefore, there needs to be some value-added investments in value-added products in order that they can meet the requirements and think of the consumers. Because invariably, in a lot of the discussion that takes place and things, we tend to leave out the consumers. And we're not speaking from a position of ignorance. We do have examples of cross-border investments in the Caribbean. For example, Eastern Caribbean Millers in St. Vincent has investments in rice in Ghana. And by way of example, and what I'm suggesting that more of that needs to happen. We have Pine Hill Dairy in Barbados having investments in citrus in Belize. Like I said, basically more of that needs to happen, and I see CDB having a key role in trying to facilitate those kinds of investments to support food security. Mm-hmm. Key going forward are the issues around infrastructure. Luther pointed to the fact that we need to have certain kinds of infrastructure, roads, etc. Let me just give you an example, which dates back, I think, about 60 years. Back in the 1950s, when Israel get a far better understanding of their circumstances, the then Prime Minister decided that their salvation lay in being food secure. And he commissioned and ensured an investment in a 300-kilometer pipeline that would allow Israel access to irrigation resources in order to be able to be food secure. Everybody said he was mad. But today, that is the salvation of Israel. So strategic investments of that nature, public good investments, are required to support investments, generally support the sector.
Thanks for that, Barton. And you know, moving on from there, I'm going to ask Nirmala, from your perspective, given what Barton said as relates to investments in value added in the value chain, rather, in the agri-sector, in the region, from your perspective, from a development, marketing, and your work with farmers, what do you see as CDB's role, or what do we need to do differently to support this process?
Based on our experience, for those who are entering into the sector, young people, women who want to use this as an opportunity to increase their livelihoods, there remains an information gap. How do I get into the sector? Where is the body of information that I can go to make my investment profitable? And this investment is the investment in agriculture. Far too many times, we have pockets of information throughout the sector. But I think we need to have one body where you can go to for information to take you throughout that value chain. Whether you want to start and sell your product as a raw agricultural commodity, or whether you want to go into further processing and sell your product as a value-added product. But there are many state laws, there are many regulations that you must comply with to get your product to that value-added stage. And there remains that information gap of the different facets and ministries and regulations that you should be aware of and comply with in order to make your product a successful value-added product, not only for the local sector, but to meet export markets as well. And I think, you know, getting that information in one place, kind of like an investment profile that investors, and I'm looking at producers as investors, entrepreneurs now, you can use that information and have that information at your fingertips, because in this day and age, information is far available. It's at the press of a button, but it needs to be in one place, in one package, to support value-added opportunities. We know that the global status is that the food industry is being driven by health and convenience. So people are eating food to nourish their bodies. They're looking at food and nutrition security. They're also eating food that are convenient because lifestyles have changed. We want food that's packaged, that's as close as possible to its natural state, and that's convenient for a meal, for the person preparing the meal, to prepare a quick and suitable meal for their family or themselves. And that's the shift that we need to look at. Luther would have alluded to agro-processed products, and that they're over-processed, and that they're particularly high in different nutrient compositions that we need not consume that amount on a daily basis. So in looking at going forward, you would have mentioned something about cassava. There are so many opportunities for complex carbohydrates that we can grow successfully here in the Caribbean, but we need the market push to create that sustainable opportunity for, let's say, cassava-based products, sweet potato-based products, if we're looking at complex carbohydrates. And that opportunities that we can grow as a Caribbean region quite successfully, because we have, while we are faced with climate change and other adverse weather patterns, God has granted us 2 seasons, unlike 4, and we can sustainably grow particular commodities throughout the year, especially tropical fruits that carry high demand value for local consumption as well as for export markets. So in terms of value added and in terms of where we are as a sector, these are some of the things I think we should focus on. Yeah.
Thanks so much for that, Nirmala. Jose, Nirmala just mentioned being aware of state laws, being aware of regulations, so that farmers and producers need to be aware of these for success to occur. Now, what I want to ask you from your experience in Belize, and I need to preface this with being fully transparent here, I happened entirely by coincidence to sit at a table at lunch today with a young farmer who said, and is not Christina, who was lamenting the challenges that she has with moving products, moving produce from her country into another member country. And these are both born member countries of the Caribbean, of the Caribbean Development Bank. So what I would like you to share with us is some, and this is from the government's perspective now, from Belize, share with us some of the key lessons that you may have learned, or maybe you have the same challenges, or you hear the same cries from your farmers, but what has your experience been? And are there any lessons that you can share with us for success with trading within the CARICOM bloc?
Thank you. First and foremost, on the first question that you asked, I wanted to challenge you and the bank to get into trouble with us as we go about challenging the lack of an appropriate policy environment in many of our member states for agriculture to thrive. We need to reform from import policy to tax laws and a number of other areas that we need to substantially reform if the sector is to be given a chance at surviving. I've seen cases of tourism investments through collection of fees. Actually, you could argue getting reimbursed for their investments. And we don't see not even anything similar being provided to the small or even the large scale producers in the region. In addition to that, Luther mentioned non-communicable diseases and what we're importing. I see us crying that we're having the whales eat plastic, but yet we're allowing plastic in the form of little styrofoam cups being fed to people to ingest because it's cheap. We need a total rethink of what we're doing if we are truly to reposition the sector. As it comes to the lament over lunch, I could have given you the same lament, both from a private sector perspective, but also from a government perspective, because the process of settling differences of dispute resolution within officialdom is extremely tedious and frustrating. So we have cases pending in the system literally for years with people being unable to trade. So that is one of the areas that we would need to look very carefully as to how we reorient it. Otherwise, again, we will not move with the swiftness to meet the challenges. And I think Luther gave us 4.7 billion reasons why we should be moving very fast, because a substantial portion of that import bill could be products produced and traded in the region. I must say, though, that in addition to that, mention was made already of the need to look at greater business-to-business contacts. I think there's very little knowledge in the region of what is available out there and the opportunities that exist. So maybe the bank could help in putting together platforms, cost-effective, but that would provide information for the business people to understand how we could move things forward. We've had some recent cases of joint investment, and right now even dealing with joint processing. Belizean producers exporting for processing to Jamaica, and Jamaica sending back processed product. They have the expertise. We have the expertise in terms of production. Let us look at utilizing the resources that we have in the region to the best economic use.
Thank you for that, Jose. Before I move on to Christina, audience, just bear in mind that we're asking you to submit your questions on Slido. Well, you can go to slido.com or you can type in www.sli.do and look for Agri-Caribbean to submit your questions. There may also be some questions there that you can vote for. So the questions that receive the most votes, we will pose to the panel. And we also have a microphone. We're going to get to your questions just now. But Christina, I have a bit of a challenge in my job. And that is that every other time the Vice President of Operations, who's sitting over there, and I meet with the President, he mentions MSMEs, and he's sitting right here. MSMEs, we need to get to the MSMEs, we need to focus on MSMEs, we need to do more of the MSMEs. So I'm very happy to see you sitting here because you are actually going to give me information that's going to help my performance appraisal. So from your perspective as a small farmer in our region, what can CDB do differently with respect to this particular sector to support your efforts?
Well, I'm going to go back to the point that Normala made about the information. The biggest struggle for a small farmer is accessing the information. You know what you want to do, but you don't know how to get there. And when you try to figure out, well, what regulations should I be following? What markets can I enter? What can I do to give my product value added? You go to your ministry or extension officer, and they have the most outdated information available. It is about 10 years behind, and then you're forced to go onto the internet. When you get onto the internet, you're now dealing with information mainly from the US, a climate that is not similar to our climate. You find it very hard to actually talk to regional farmers. You would assume it would be easy to talk to a farmer in Trinidad. I don't even know how to connect to them. So it's only through recent workshops that we took it into our own hands with WhatsApp, and we started to literally network and tell each other, if we have friends in one island, please add your farmer friend to this WhatsApp group. And we start to share actual real data. And that is something that's lacking in the region. Farmers should be sharing what their production yields are in aquaponics. I'm in aquaponics. Aquaponics systems is a good example. What time of the year are you planting certain seeds? What growth rates are you getting? Which ones are handling the heat? Which ones are not handling? Who are you buying from? Which suppliers? And that is all information you can share without giving away any trade secrets.
You're saying right now there is no established digital platform?
No, there's nowhere for us to go except private sector where we're actually just doing it ourselves. So anybody that enters, if they don't know one of us, they don't know how to get onto that WhatsApp group. So it's very much about people have to now network to figure out how to access this information, and it should be readily available. It should be with the extension officers. It should be with the relevant ministries, and that's something that I find is very lacking right now.
And how can CDB support that effort? I mean, because I have to say, this is actually quite shocking to me. You're suggesting that the small farmers network in the region is essentially operating through WhatsApp.
Yes.
And that we as a region don't have an established framework.
No.
And we're talking about transformation here. The president did a speech this morning on transformation, and the farmers in the region actually aren't supported digitally by any established framework. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. I mean, we've been begging for years, why can't somebody come up with an app, a very simple app to connect the farmers? Because, the farmer is not going to have time to sift through all the information from every country. That is where the ministries and the extension officers come into play. They can sift the data and put it up. So if you actually want to find planting spaces for lettuce at a certain temperature, you should be able to log into the app and find that information. Similarly, if you want to know what other aquaponic farms in your region are using when they have too much rain or certain deficiencies or certain diseases. So that's actually what we're sharing. We're sharing things like pictures of our leaves, treatments, the dosages that we've been using. So all of that can be uploaded into a very simple app that any farmer could just log in and access.
I'm actually lost for words right now, sorry. And that really happens. But Barton, I'm looking at you. I mean, you're Cardi. How is it that the farmers in our region are struggling and relying on WhatsApp? I mean, this can't possibly be good enough.
You should not be lost for words.
Okay, tell me why.
Because essentially, and so on, what we are seeing, that's a reflection of the dismantling of the research and extension systems across the Caribbean over the last 30 years. In fact, probably more than 30 years. You remember, at a time, we were in the vanguard of this business. We had people like T.P. Lecky and those guys out of Jamaica dealing with the development of cattle you had Vernon Roy's, you had the group in Trinidad like Wilson and Spence dealing with the development of sweet potato varieties and whatever, right? And we abandoned all of that. In fact, recently I heard the Minister of Agriculture in Jamaica talk about rebuilding Borders as a premier center. We need to reinvest in our research and extension systems because what is being said is absolutely correct. The CDB, for example, did a study on the adoption and use of greenhouse, quote-unquote, greenhouse technology in the region, and discovered and think that most of them fail. Lots of excitement. Yes, this thing is magic. We are going to be able to, you know, this is the best thing since sliced bread. But when we went in the field and did the examination, most of them failed because, like what Christine says, because of absence of support within either the public or the private systems within the Caribbean, they go to the internet, they import technology, and invariably it isn't fit for purpose, fit for our purpose. But to get it fit for purpose, it means that there needs to be an investment in research and extension to examine or to develop within the context of the environmental and socioeconomic circumstances of the Caribbean in order to be able to deal with the circumstances in the Caribbean. Similarly, as Jose is saying, I've had the fortune to have a debate with a former Prime Minister of Barbados, and he admitted at the end that, look, perhaps something, if Barbados had invested in agriculture to the same extent they invested in tourism and manufacturing at the time of independence, we would be farther along than we now are. I won the argument, but I didn't win the war because he didn't give me any more money. Okay? For us to invest in the sector. And I want us to understand, investing in the sector is not only about investing in production. We got to invest in knowledge management, we got to invest in communication, we got to invest in accountability, in research and development. It has to be a total approach to this.
I'm very happy you said that, Barton, because my next question to you actually is, tell us first, if there are deficiencies in our present agricultural research systems in the region that prevent us from adopting best practices, and if so, how can CDB support you in moving to enable these research systems to move to best practice?
Given that CDB is a bank, you know, it'd be very easy for me to say finance.
It would be.
But I will not
is that the solution?
I will not say that. Because quite frankly, from where I sit, finance comes with responsibility. It is like a recent directive which I got with respect to right-sizing the cardio organization. The interpretation of right-sizing is that you cut staff and send them home. That is not my interpretation. My interpretation of right-sizing is the right number of staff with the right qualifications, right, deployed in the most appropriate way, using contemporary infrastructure in a frame that they are continuously able to develop. Let me just digress a little bit and look at what I regard as probably the biggest success story in agricultural research in modern history. Brazil, Embrapa, facing a rate of inflation 30 years ago that could not be computed on supercomputers. You got paid today and your money you had spent it all today because your money had no value. They had a PL40 program and thing from the United States government, free rice and whatever and so on. They took those resources and they put it into a foundation. And the first thing they did with those resources was to send a set of Brazilians out to universities across the globe and train them to the master's and PhD level, and brought them back and said, listen, this is the vision that we have. And you see the results of that vision when you look at agriculture today in Brazil. Okay? So that kind of strategic investment is required in research, but done so responsibly. Like I said, on a bedrock of accountability, on a bedrock of an IT infrastructure that we must have proper laboratories, we must build strategic linkages with the international scientific community, because we can't all do it ourselves. We also must coalesce the research resources that we have in the Caribbean. That we have University of the West Indies, University of Guyana, University of Belize, you got tertiary level colleges in every single country doing associate degrees in agriculture. You got CARD and CAFSA. All of those need to be put in an innovation platform where we all going down the road with the same purpose. That is now not happening. There was an attempt called Pro-C Carib that didn't work. But we need to pull those resources together for the good of driving the technology development in the agricultural sector that Luther alluded to.
All right, thank you. Thanks for that, Barton. First, I want to point out to the audience, we have some questions up there. Go online and vote. We're going to come to those shortly. But I want to inject a dose of realism here. Nirmala, as Luther pointed out, we've been speaking a lot within this particular study, and one of the areas we plan to focus on, of course, is the value chains and value systems. And we have recently done some work at CDB in supporting food safety management systems. So compliance with internationally recognized food safety standards is increasingly a prerequisite for participation in high-value markets. We know this. Exports, sales to hotels and supermarkets, even within the region. The question I want to ask, and why I say I want to inject a dose of realism here, is does the average small farmer in the Caribbean have the capacity to comply with these standards? Or are we setting bars that will essentially eliminate the average small farmer from competing?
So if we're looking at international food safety regulatory systems, which you would have alluded to are the high-value markets, the simple answer is no.
No.
Our small farmers are not ready. Let us take the Food Safety Modernization Act, for example. That act carries 7 rules for compliance to the food safety system. One of the rules is the produce safety rule, which directly targets our growers or farmers. And in that rule, there are lists, perhaps 7 or 8 aspects that farmers need to pay attention to reduce their risk of transferring foodborne diseases onto the food. Some of the things that we need to look that the rule asks for is water quality, soil ameliorants. But while, and I can speak for Trinidad and Tobago, we do have some qualified persons to extend the training, so we're building capacity. We've just started training farmers in groups of 25 on the produce safety rule in a bid to get them compliant or aware of the export requirements with respect to food safety to the US in particular. How many of our farmers can meet the standards that are required? We're talking simple things like washrooms on the field, PPE during harvest. These call for some bit of investment. While the rules are clear-cut, there are also recommendations on how you can make the rules more efficient and more effective for small groups, for small farm holdings. It does require some bit of investment. Not only that, critically, it requires that change management. It requires a change in the thinking of the farmer. What traditionally you would have thought was the correct thing to do, now you're being told is incorrect. It calls for more training on the farm. Is the small farmer in a position to continuously train? Are you in a position now to provide the necessary facilities that are required to bring your product to market for a high-value market in accordance with these rules? But it also lends itself to not only high-end markets. As you alluded to, we do have local markets that require that value of product.
Absolutely.
But it doesn't only happen in this the tourism and hotel sector. It happens right here in our school feeding program. They are a vulnerable group in our society who require safe food every day. even in our own households, we have vulnerable family members who also requires food, safe food every day. And it is incumbent on us as a government not only to provide food for financial gain, but also to provide safe food for the entire sector. For each of us who need to eat food, maybe 3, 5, 1 time for the day, but it is incumbent on us that we set the principles, we invest in what I would call model farms, where farmers can learn, where they can see the benefits of investing. Let's say you have to construct 2 toilets, or you have to ensure that your workers use gloves every day, and every time they empty a crate, they need to change a glove. I'm just saying that maybe these are some of the principles that need to be practiced on the farm to ensure food safety. It is an investment.
Absolutely.
And farmers need to see the value of that investment long term, whether they're small, they're medium, or they're commercial farmers.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, Jose, I'm looking at, you know, from the sovereign perspective. Unfortunately for you, you're the government representative on the panel. And I want to hear, I mean, Nirmala has just said essentially our small farmers are not ready to meet these international standards, which really, you know, is a bit of a crisis. What is Belize doing, and more particularly in your position as CEO with respect to agriculture in Belize, what is Belize doing to support this effort to upskill and prepare our farmers for trade on the international markets?
As I said earlier, it has to do with investment. Belize took a decision probably about 12 years ago to invest in our Agriculture Health Authority, Belize Agriculture Health Authority, which is in charge of food safety, agriculture health, and quarantine. They've developed quite a bit of capacity in providing some of the services required. It's not a complete set. There's still need for more investments. But I tend to differ because it depends what you're exporting and where you want to export to. To be very honest, I think strategically.
You're saying it would be easier for us to reach.
I'm saying that look, it's like Walmart.
Right.
They will work you down on half a cent value of something. There are some markets that we should not even attempt to intervene in. We have to be far more strategic as we go about developing our sectors. But small farmers from Belize that produce cane, that produce bananas, that produce several other products actually end up in the market. And we have a growing base of products coming out, not growing as fast as we would want to, but there's a prime example, a woman entrepreneur in Belize by the name of Marie Sharp. She's landing her processed product in the US. We've swept the country, almost 5 years. We've swept the country, the herd, to ensure that we can rely on the health status. That immediately, after we finished the first 2 sweep, the complete sweep of the entire country, tagging every animal in the country, prices went up because people now realize that we had a safe source of livestock and they paid a premium for it. So if we look at it from that perspective, the investments can occur and we can enter markets, but it's not an overnight process. There's no quick fix to some of the hurdles that we will have to pass. But I really don't want to say that we can't. We can, but this is why I said earlier, we really need to invite the bank to look at a far deeper set of policy interventions as to how the countries will invest to make it possible. Because whether we want or not, we already have the export market in our domestic market.
Absolutely.
Our farmers have to be competing with products that are highly subsidized, coming from more developed economies, and quite frankly, a lot of them are surviving, but beyond surviving, thriving.
All right, fantastic points. I'm going to turn to our audience now. I know we had some, the polling was going on Slido. I'm going to ask if anyone, there's a mic at the back. I know you have many burning questions, so we ask you to step forward at this time. with some of your questions. And yeah, step forward with your questions at this time. I think I want to do first, the question that's leading in the poll right now is what steps need to be taken to strengthen food security partnerships in the region? Our audience wants to hear a response to that, and so do I, because it's part of our work program. And we want to hear some of these solutions. So what do we need to do as a region to strengthen food security partnerships?
Develop a business template for the sector. It's as core as that and as simple as that. Agriculture has to be seen as a business. We have long had the perception that it's a sector that depends on handouts. It probably did in the past when we had preferential prices going into Europe, etc. Those no longer exist. We have to, in our own minds, and from there our actions, will change the perception of the sector and lead to the appropriate investments that are actually required to make it thrive. Look, we also have to look at the multidimensional aspect of agriculture. And it's something that we have to carefully look at. Agriculture right now, food insecurity, if you look at it in the current context right now, equal national insecurity. You see mass migration right now in certain countries and a level of the degrading of citizen security, etc. It is not far-fetched that we could end up in similar circumstances. We've got to put agriculture in a totally different context.
And treat it as a business. But you know, I want us to move to the next question. Sorry, Barton, you want to come in here.
But in addition to treating it as a business, and perhaps as part of treating it as a business, to my mind, we also need to put agriculture within a proper legislative and regulatory framework, a la the US Farm Bill, the India Farm Bill, etc. Some frame, because I then refer back to the only time that Barbados was food secure, the only time that Barbados produced all of the food that they consumed, during the Second World War. And that was occasioned by a legislative framework, which said what you planted, when you planted, no. We're now talking about investing in cassava flour. There was a factory at that time in Barbados producing cassava and sweet potato flour. Right? And we're now struggling to get back there. But there was a legislative framework that governed it. And to support my point, where we have had successful agricultural endeavors in the past, banana, sugar, their actions are enshrined in legislation. You look at the tourism and the development of tourism, it is circumscribed by legislation and regulation. And I believe and so on, it's high time I think that the same thing attends all of agriculture.
I think that's a fantastic point.
Could I make a comment on bananas and sugar? Because yes, it has disappeared in a number of the countries, but in countries like Belize, they continue to thrive. And I think we have to look at that when policies are being developed. The fact of the matter is, in the last 18 years, we were told in 2000 to get out of bananas and sugar production. In the 18 years since then, those two industries have brought in probably about 1.8, 1.9 billion US dollars of income to the economy of Belize. Do they still face challenges? Yes, they do. But they are privately run businesses. And that is what is key to success in a lot of what we do. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to make, especially sugar, and the debate is ongoing right now, profitable in the long term. We have to move from raw exports to direct consumption exports. The investments will be made, but look, except for a very few products right now, there's quite a bit that we can, if we put the environment in place, we would be able to invest in it successfully.
Thanks for that, Jose. I want to come to Christina. There's a question here that's polling quite quite high. And it is that as a young farmer, well, you represent two demographics on the panel, young and female, of course. There's a perception that agriculture requires high degrees of experience or technical knowledge, making risky and therefore, I guess as making risky decisions, and therefore limited to a specific segment. I think the person is being politically correct here, they mean old men. How do we break down this barrier to entry to support participation and investment, Christine? What's your experience being, and what advice would you give?
First of all, the word that's sticking out at me is perception. It's actually not a perception, it's a fact. Agriculture, you need to be trained. We need to get away from that old-fashioned belief that it is for poor, uneducated people. I have 2 degrees, a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science.
Yeah.
We need to promote that you're going into agriculture as a business, as a profession. Okay, it's not your last resort. When you're coming out of high school, you should be looking at universities you can attend to get the training and the background you need to be a farmer. So that, I think, is the first thing we have to get rid of in the Caribbean. When I went to Canada, that was my first exposure to farmers at universities. They had an entire area for farmers. Basically, they were there on government scholarships. So basically, if your family was in farming, you could send your children to continue the business, and they were trained in the most current techniques. And that is something that UE isn't doing. When I first came and said I want to do fish farming, I had to go to Guelph in Canada. UE was not able to train me in aquaponics or fish farming. I then had to go to the University of the Virgin Islands to get aquaponics training. It's only finally in my master's that I was able to convince them to let me do my thesis on tilapia farming. So we have to get away from that belief that you don't need the training, that all you need is to go to a community college and get a 6-month degree, and that is going to give you all the tools you need. What is also missing is business. They're not realizing that you have to give farmers business training as well. You're running a business. You're not just trying to get your fish to grow. You need to be able to keep the business going, pay your employees, pay your taxes, make it actually function. So that is one difficult thing. In terms of gender, the one thing I've learned is that the traditional farming practices, the farming practices that we still embrace in the Caribbean, are generally directed towards men. They are labor intensive, they are hard for a woman to do, whereas the newer practices in the US and Canada are gender equal. They're looking at technology, and with technology, you're making it an even playing field. So a woman can be a manager of a fish farm in Canada. When you come down here and we're using old school ponds full of mud, we're using nets that we have to pull manually, we don't have tractors, we don't have pumps, you're disadvantaging women from the start. They cannot apply for those jobs because they just physically cannot do them. So we have to invest in that technology that allows women to not just be on the farm sorting fish or just planting seedlings, that there's enough technology that they can actually run, operate, and manage the farm.
So there's certainly scope there for a development organization to invest in that kind of technology.
No, definitely.
Certainly with our MSMEs. We have a question from the floor. Yeah, we just get the mic, stand it back, please. Go ahead. Just state your name, where you organization you're from.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Diane Francis from ECA.
Okay.
It's not a question, and I'm happy to come after Nirmala and Christine because I'm drawing strength from the females on the panel. I don't normally talk in August events such as this. I want to make 3 comments. 1, agriculture, specifically farming, does not happen in institutions. It happens on the farm, in the field. And institutions operate within a very formal, established sector. The farmers do not. So oftentimes there's a tendency to try to impose a formal sector on very informal operations. And there's always a clash. And I'm happy that you said you're from project development at CDB. Most times when you have development activities in agriculture at the farm level, they come through projects. And again, the projects have a certain expectations, particularly when the stakeholders are farmers. And again, oftentimes those expectations are not met. And then the issue of sustainability becomes a major factor that causes projects not to continue. So I'm saying that from a CDB perspective, we have to find a way to bridge the gap between what we do as formal institutions and what is operating on the farm level as informal operations. If you go to let's say 75% of the farmers, like the Mala will tell you, a lot of them don't keep basic records. The formal sector requires record keeping. A lot of them are not certified. The formal sector requires some sort of certification to prove that you can do what you say you're going to do, whether you're a farmer or a processor. So we need to try to find a way to accommodate a very informal operator, which is a farmer, into the formal way of doing business in the formal sector. That's the first thing. The president mentioned MSMEs, and I was very happy to hear MSMEs. And I'm very proactive and I'm a big advocate for agri-SMEs. A lot of the agri-SMEs we work with in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean through ICA are female, single-headed female households. And they persevere against every single odds you can imagine. And a lot of the issues is not getting raw material for their small operations or not finding their way in the formal marketing channels, the same value chain we speak about. So again, the value chain system, again, is geared towards persons who are able to enter the value chain and stay in it. The agri-MSs are not able to enter the value chain because, again, they're not operating within the book record keepings, the certification and so forth. Some of them cannot even access institutions to bridge the gap between what we do in the formal sector and how we operate with those persons who are not yet at that level. Because the issue is what can be done if the agencies involved in pushing into regional trade or fostering business and trade, the UN and so forth, they have a role to play. But the difficulty is you don't find a lot of collaboration across institutions that work within the sector, and this is what's causing us to walk over each other's feet or sometimes conflict at the ground level. And the last thing I'd like to say is, again, I'm coming back to projects. Being the project development person in the CDB, we have to find a way to prepare or to write better projects that meet the needs of the stakeholders and not meet the needs of accountability for financial expenditure or rate of expenditure. Projects have to satisfy what the people on the ground require. And that means you really have to go down to the ground to understand how they operate in order for us to write projects that benefit them at the ground level. And once we do that, I think we're going to get a movement or a groundswell of people at the ground wanting to be part of the formal economy where they will keep the records, they will get certified, they will do business as how it is supposed to do business, and eventually we'll get to the transformation that we're looking for in agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Daniel?
Thank you very much. Excellent. Well said. I think we have another I think is this a question for the panelists?
Well,
there's a request to...
I have a request to rebut that a little bit.
Sure.
One of my frustrations, though, when I started up, is that the focus is always on these small farmers. And I've never understood why. Why are we still telling young people that the only potential they have is a $5,000 loan to start with 50 fish in a tank? Why is that always the focus? We're always keeping them small. I know there are plenty established small farmers, but the youth is really where you're going to get the big change. You need to get young people who are willing to set up tanks that are producing 2 tons of fish per tank. We need to move away from always just saying that the only support we're giving are these little small grants, these little, we teach you how to catch fish, but we don't teach you anything about growth rates or feed conversion. We're keeping it too simple. And that is my frustration, because everything I did on my own. And that's why it took me from 2006 to 2013 to actually get where I wanted to get. How much easier it would have been if I could have made that just a year or 2 years and my operation is up and running. So there are young people out there who want to make farming a business. They don't want to just be making $300 a month and then have to go and get a second job. They want farming to be their full-time job, and that is kind of what you should be approaching when you're saying you want small farmers. They still should be producing enough to make it a business and to make it their salary for the month. So that is something that I think needs to be addressed.
I think that's a fantastic perspective, Christina. You're suggesting we need a mindset change, not just for the farmers, but in the development community as well. Thank you for that. I think we have a question on the floor.
2 things. Firstly, I must say...
Just state your name and where...
Christopher Malcolm. I'm from Jamaica. But I had the great pleasure as a young boy at Monroe, visiting Bodle's estate and meeting T.P. Lecky. So I know the great man and I know what he was about. Having said that, however, what I've also learned over time is that notwithstanding what you've just said about big and the rest and so on, it's always about appropriateness. And we have to be careful that we do not lump things in an area of thinking, well, we must think in this big way or this small way. And I go to something I pointed out, well, I raised it on Slido, but I'll nevertheless raise it because I think it's important. Sure. That there is a question, because from my observation, the most reliable evidence of collaborative agriculture and production integration, if you want to call it that, across the Caribbean that I've seen, is in relation to ganja, believe it.
Is in relation to
ganja. Ganja.
Okay.
I don't smoke, I have nothing to do with ganja, however, I've seen it. And what I can say from experience is that you go into communities where ganja is grown, and everybody, people plant together, they protect their crops together, they have been in drip irrigation long before anybody else was there, and they have been finding creative ways to grow and develop their product without a lot of training. And we have to be careful when we speak about training, because there's one thing about going to educational institutions and the rest of it. There's something about innate knowledge and about being able to develop what we have areas of comparative advantage in the region. And a lot of the things about fish and all the other beautiful things that we talk about will not have the same level of comparative advantage, for example, where things such as ganja and so on would have. The question I've raised for the CDB is, with the emergence of ganja for what it is, I leave this very conference to head to Miami, where I'm speaking to a group of bankers about banking ganja. Because people are interested, what is the role and function, and how is CDB progressing in that area? Because it's an area we can no longer overlook. We can no longer overlook it because of the value chain that is associated with it, and the fact that it has shown more than anything else. They have done studies in Jamaica showing that there have been at least 70,000 or so people who have been directly involved, and when you do the multiplier effect, it's a significant number of persons who are involved, who have done well, sent people to universities, sent children all over the place. And it is an industry that's emerging, and I think the CDB has to start thinking very seriously about how it is that you're going to assist with the regulatory and other questions related to it, and also with financing, recognizing that it's not necessarily a big industry, but it's an industry with a big impact. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You responded?
Fortunately for me, the president and both vice presidents are in the room. And I always believe in giving seniors the opportunity to respond, especially when they outrank me. But no, in all seriousness, I think it's a fair point. We have not, as a bank, certainly developed an approach with respect to this. We have to, of course, appreciate the fact that it is still an illegal commodity in many of our borrowing member countries. And as you're well aware, CDB cannot have this thing finance activities which are deemed to be outside of the bounds of the legal framework of our borrowing member countries. So while we may discuss how we may support it, at this time we certainly can't invest in its production.
However, from the Cardi perspective, in recognition of various mouthings from heads of states who are speaking very strongly about investments and things in this area, as well as what is happening on the ground, we've actually signed a memorandum of understanding with a company out of Canada who wants assistance from Cardi to do field research for them in St. Vincent, where there is legislation. Right? In fact, I was there last week looking at how we can be able to proceed within the confines of the law in order to be able to proceed with research, the kind of research services that is required and to support that development.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Barton. We have another question on the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. In fact, I hope I'm allowed to make comments. It's not a question.
Oh, please.
Okay. If I understood you at the outset, what you're seeking are some recommendations for CDBs, what I hope will be a long-term engagement with the sector. My name is Vassal Stewart. I'm from the Caribbean Agribusiness Association and the Caribbean Agribusiness Development Company. My first point I want to make is that CDB needs to have a long-term commitment to the sector. Over the years, CDB, I think, has waxed warm and cold. Agribusiness sector require long-term policy support and financial support. So that I would want to see that your new plan have at least a 20-year horizon. It cannot be the usual 5 and 10 year approaches. Secondly, most of the issues that Luther identified as challenges can be addressed through appropriate policies and financing, whether it's technology acquisition, the issue of R&D, issues relating to the quality management systems. The technical know-how is there. Very often what is missing are the appropriate policies. My friend from Belize talked about appropriate legislation. I think Barton did as well. So I want to just put a couple of things for CDB's consideration. Apart from a long-term commitment, second thing I want us to have a look at is the issue of financing. At the last Ministers of Agriculture meeting, there was a request and an agreement for the establishment of a US $1 billion agribusiness development fund to support a whole range of projects that we have identified with tremendous potential from both a social and economic impact. So what we're saying to CDB, one, we want you to engage with us in the private sector in looking at how we can have this fund established. So for example, we're suggesting the need for an equity fund. The banks in the region make tremendous amount of profits. And we have suggested to the government over the years is to provide the banks with some tax allowances to allow them to put perhaps a 1% of their profits into a fund that would support equity investment in bankable proposals. And this is not necessarily just for agriculture. So we're saying we'd like to have your support on that. Secondly, when Luther made his presentation, he pointed out that the Caribbean is about 1/10 the productivity of the US, which is our major supplier of food. In an open economy, it's difficult for us to compete in any product or any industry if we have that disparity in productivity. That requires investment in R&D. We suggested to the government more than 5 years ago that they apply a 1% tax on food import and use that to support an organized and well-structured R&D program in the region. They backed at it because there was the argument that the ministers of finance will not support it. We want to suggest to CDB that you do the economic and social analysis to indicate that that 1% is insignificant in terms of the way food price increases. Since then, food prices have gone up far more than 1%, and nobody has died as a result. And their concern was that they would not support it because the Minister of Finance is going to feel it's a burden. They see it that way because the empirical data to support this application of a minimal tax has not been presented to them. I think CDB is in a very strong position to lead in that regard. Thirdly, we'd want to suggest the need for support for an institution that will provide continuous analysis of opportunities in the region and to develop bankable projects that we could take to the private sector. It's not the private sector is unwilling to invest. We see investment downstream. If you look at what's happening here in Trinidad, tremendous amount of investment taking place in the food service, in restaurants, in international franchises. We're not investing in those franchises that use regional raw material. It's all international coffee or international French fries when we could produce cassava and sweet potato in the region. There are tremendous opportunities. I don't want to take up too much time. I'm simply saying to CDB, we'd like to have the opportunity to engage Luther and hopefully some more support to him in the organization so that we in the private sector can come to you with what we believe are viable economic opportunities in the sector. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Before we come to our next question, I know we have another question queued up. I want to turn to Nirmala here from the development marketing perspective. And one of the questions that we have from Slido from the audience is, can digital and technology, I guess this is transformation, attract more young people into agriculture as it becomes more sexy? Or I guess it could help it become more sexy.
The short answer to that is yes. Technology can attract more young people into the sector. Makes things less labor intensive, makes things more savvy, more fancy. The critical issue is financing for those young persons who do not have the necessary support to get into that technology. As a young person, even if you go to any financial institution, they always ask for, what they ask for? Collateral. As a young person, where can you get collateral to invest in technology for agriculture? They want to invest by all means, but they need that level of support. So my short answer is yes.
Yes, absolutely. Let's come.
Thank you. Brian Samuel, CDB. Not so much a question, just a comment. I have a small piece of land in Grenada, and I give it to a young farmer, and he farms on it. And he says to me, he has no problem selling anything he produces. The hotels will buy it all, or the supermarkets will buy it all. His problem is finding people to work on the land. All he can pay is 80 EC a day, which is the going rate. But them boys and them, as he calls them, sitting on the sidewalks while he is busting his tail, sweating. If you Google Caribbean farmer now, you'll come up with a man with a cutlass. This is yesterday's model. Many, 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 many years ago, I used to work in aquaculture, and I commend Christine for what she has done. Modern, super intensive aquaculture is highly profitable, but it is extremely expensive to set up. The same thing with aquaponics. So I think what we need here, two strategies that are needed, is one is education, and two is access to finance. And I think that, Christine, you pointed this out extremely well.
Christina, just so we clear, it's Christina.
Yeah. Christina, sorry. Yeah. You had to educate yourself, and I don't know how you overcome your challenges with finance. But if we had scholarships available for people to study aquaponics, aquaculture, and so on, and financing available, I dare say if Barbados had 20, 30 more people like Christina, Barbados wouldn't need to import food and fish. It could feed itself, like it did during the war. So I think that, we need to modernize the sector, get away from the old thing of a man with a cutlass, educate people, give them finance, give them technical capacity, and then that's a road to transformation.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that, Brian. I want to actually come off of that point, if I could extend it to Christina. Christina, Barbados is recognized as among, and you must have heard this question a million times, yeah. But it's a question I want to answer. I saw you on television in Barbados a few times, and this jumped out at me. Barbados is recognized as among the most water-scarce countries in the world, not just the region, in the world. Aquaculture is, from my limited knowledge of it, a pretty water-intensive activity. What would have prompted you to get into this particular type of farming in Barbados?
Okay, well, first of all, I just wanted to get into fish farming, first of all. But then I had to really be realistic. I wanted to work in Barbados. So it comes back down to research yet again. You can't just decide, I like salmon, so I'm going to do salmon in Barbados. You have to look at the climate, what the fish require, and then, of course, the technology that's available and the systems that are available. The systems I use are actually designed for the Caribbean, specifically designed for the Caribbean from the University of the Virgin Islands. A green water system and their aquaponics recirculation system. By the time you put those in, they're like, I think it's about 30 times more efficient than pond farming, which is what we have been promoting forever. So we've always been telling people that you should be doing pond farming, and Jamaica can get away with that, Guyana, Trinidad, but Barbados could never have done pond farming. So they came up with a technology that is 30 times more efficient in water usage. So even though people assume I use a lot of water, water is the lowest bill on my farm. We recycle all of our water. We only lose to evaporation, and therefore we kind of shade or cool to reduce evaporation as well. The biggest cost on my farm is actually labor. It is actually the people who run the farm, because you need to be trained, you need to be skilled. It's usually automated systems or systems that are following certain requirements. You'd even think electricity is high in an island like Barbados, but because the system is designed to be sustainable, it's looking at your lowest electrical use. So we actually utilize gravity a lot of the time. So there are ways to get around the challenges that countries like Barbados face, where we don't have a lot of water, we don't have a lot of space, we have extremely high electrical costs. In terms of the labor, the thing is to be efficient. So I remember we had said that earlier, that basically you need to have the production level up to match your staffing. You can't just have 4 and 5 staff members and your production level is low, so it comes back down to your business model. So despite being water scarce, water has been the least of my problems with producing fish. And when we look even at the tourism market, they are huge wasters of water. compared to even if we scaled up aquaculture in Barbados. So it's about having your research and being able to speak to, even with the government ministers, to show them that, you know, even if we were to increase our production, we would not be impacting the water wastage or water usage in Barbados. As well as with tilapia, they can also handle water that isn't fit for humans, in terms of brackish water. So you're picking species that you could actually be using wells and stuff that humans would not want to pump off of because they have salt intrusion, but we can do that for tilapia. So there are lots of opportunities in Barbados, and I think we just have to get away from that whole water scarce and always being panicked that aquaculture is a bad thing in a water scarce island, not with technology. And if you look at Israel, they're a desert country and they're one of the biggest producers of tilapia in recirculating systems. They're very efficient with it.
We rapidly run out of time, but you touched on a very important point, which I want to extend to the rest of the panel. I mean, we have represented here government, development, marketing, and of course, the regional perspective. And you're speaking to the use of technology to mitigate the risks and the limitations within a particular aspect of the sector. And how can this knowledge be transferred across or other, well, from CDB's perspective, or other borrowing member countries? I mean, this is news to me. The technology that you're using this is quite fantastic. But how many other of our 18 other borrowing member countries are actually taking advantage of this? I don't know, Jose, do you want to jump in?
Let me just draw a reference to what is happening today and what is probably the most advanced of the agricultural sectors in the Caribbean, and that is the poultry industry. They have come together and formed the Caribbean Poultry Association. And they share information and technology very, very, very quickly. They also go every year, annually they go every year to the United States and to Europe to consume and to bring back and to use and to adapt and apply new information, new technology with respect to. So this is a vehicle or model that can be used with respect and things to help me to promulgate and new technology. There is some work now going on to help do the same thing with the pig sector. And remember, if you look at the advances that have made with wind tunnel technology in poultry, where they've been able to increase the stocking rate in poultry from 1 bird per square foot to 1.5 birds per square foot, right? With an investment that they worked out, which cost $200,000 US dollars that they can pay back for in 2 years. So the banks readily lend money to the poultry sector. Okay, as compared, in fact, that tends to pertain to the livestock sector more so than the crop sector. The banks more readily lend money to that sector because invariably that sector is locked into particular markets. It is not, indiscriminate. It's not fickle. The crop farmers often, wake up this morning and plant cucumbers and then discover that everybody is planting cucumbers and then they can't get them sold. So there's a level of discipline that needs to come into the sector in terms of production planning, dealing with the issues and so on of looking towards, say, contract farming for the hotels or the manufacturers, as the case might be. We built a system when Four Seasons Hotel first came into Nevis. We built a system working with the farmers, the extension officers, the input suppliers, the importers, the policymakers in St. Kitts to arrive at a system that allows for a throughput of agricultural produce into the Four Seasons Hotel in Nevis. And this was this is 1989, 1990. I was there 2 years ago and I asked the question, is this thing still working? And the answer was yes. That was a hallelujah moment for me. So it is possible for us to be able to build these systems and things across the Caribbean to make things happen. But also let me just make the point too.
I want Nirmala to come in on this because I want to hear from this. Go ahead.
There's this emphasis on small and medium-sized enterprises. We cannot ignore the needs of what we call large farms in the Caribbean, because it is from them you're going to still get 70, 80% of your production to meet your food security needs. And they are also particularly challenged by some of the points made by Luther in terms of productivity. Right? That you need to deal with productivity in the sugar industry, you need to deal with productivity in rice, you need to deal with productivity and so on in grain, because we ultimately, if we expect Huntington to play within the global market space, then we gotta raise our game.
On the live, thanks.
Daniel, I want to bring to the attention a very live situation that as NAMDEFCO has been faced with a number of times. And many sectors turn to us to identify solutions to marketing. Not only marketing primary products or value-added products, but bringing products to a market. And we're talking here about financial constraints. As a small farmer, or as a cooperative of farmers, or farmers who, as we just heard, wish to engage in some type of contract farming, many of our farmers are engaged in short-term crop production. There are few, of course, who are engaged in long-term crop production, but the buyers sometimes request long credit periods. As a farmer, how can you sustain your agriculture by having to wait sometimes 30, 60, 90-day credit periods to reinvest? As a farmer, you are faced with loans because you need to reinvest. Non-payment of loans accrue interest. You may have guaranteed markets, but we need to bridge that gap where farmers are paid on a closer rotational basis than what the buyer in some cases can offer. And this is a real situation. We have government institutions who we know, subventions don't come every month. It comes on a phased basis. If you were to supply, let's say, an institutional buyer with produce, it's a secure contract. It's a consistent market for fresh produce, local, no need for import produce. But as a farmer or as a group of farmers, there needs to be some financier to be able to sustain that business model. And these are real issues. These are opportunities that our farmers and investors potentially have, but we need somebody to do that financing, to support and pay those farmers in a timely manner so that they can reinvest in the necessary technologies, run their lives because they're not farming because of a hobby, all right? To be able to continue, and that's one of the greatest challenges. And perhaps there's a package you can look at as a CDB, that type of financing to support farmers to get regular payments while the bigger buyers can, take their time and accumulate their funds because obviously they have greater overheads than the farmer. Something to look at.
Perhaps as part of the same value chain that Luther was speaking to earlier, I think that would be a key component of it. Well, I think what we need to do now is to give your parting thoughts. We've heard quite a bit. We saw the presentation from Luther, and we've gotten some interesting perspectives from the audience. So, Jose, let me begin with you. I mean, we're seeking to embrace the opportunities in agriculture. What would be your parting thoughts to the audience and those joining online, and of course then to us as carry bankers?
I believe reform of the policy space within our national governments, but also too at the regional level. A system that works to support production and trade. A recognition that government and the private sector has to walk alongside each other. And at times we have to step back and take the lead from the private sector to get things done. Because at the end of the day, they're the ones required to be competitive. A recognition that in the Caribbean region, it's just like anywhere else. They demand competitive pricing, they demand quality, they demand consistency of supply. And we've got to meet those targets if we're to if we're to survive and to thrive. This discussion, I think, is just the tip of the iceberg that we would have to have as you go about formulating and finalizing your interventions. But I believe, too, there's a lot of infrastructure work that needs to be invested in. We've not really touched on the aspects of climate change mitigation. Investments both at the enterprise level, but even more so at the public sector level, water systems, etc., early warning systems. One of the calls I absolutely have to make to the bank is to take a step back and have a rethink on disaster recovery. I don't know if there's anybody in the region, but I know certainly in Belize, commercial agriculture insurance is unaffordable. But as we see, we get hit not by hurricanes. As Luther said, the silent killer is drought. And so many other, the whole climate variability aspect, while we're working to mitigate the risks and make the sector more profitable, and it can be done, we also know that at some point we will be hit hard and we will need to replant and recover. The speed on which that recovery assistance comes, at the moment in many of our countries, it's dependent on internal decisions, but I think we need something far more structured where the farmers and government could co-invest in some sort of an early recovery fund. Look, this is not the manufacturing sector. The farmer, if he gets a blowdown or something like that, he needs to replant the following day because he has 2 months, 3 months before he has any chance of recovering and of earning an income. It's a different ball game. We need a different level of treatment to this sector. It is not special consideration. It is consideration that is appropriate to the nature of the business we're trying to run. And while productivity in the US shows so high, what we did not discuss is the level of direct subsidies and state support that those operations get. What we did not discuss is that a lot of that comes from industrialized farming complex, totally different than what we have here in the region. We have sufficient brain power within the bank, within our countries, to be able to design a system of food production that will see us be stable and be viable in the long term. Keep in mind one of the things that I said earlier, food security, and the opposite of that, food insecurity, equals national insecurity. Just look around us what's happening. We have to take this thing far more serious than we are right now.
Thank you for that, Jose. Thank you.
Can I just add on that point of food insecurity? And I want to focus this question to each of you in the room here today. God forbid, should there be a natural disaster in any one of our Caribbean islands, how much food do we have on our islands to sustain our present population until food arrives? Do any of us know the answer to that question?
Well, considering how much we grow in Barbados, I shudder to think.
It's about 5 days in Barbados. Right?
Yeah, it's not a full week in Barbados, I don't think.
No. Let me just please, right?
Please.
Fortunately or unfortunately, within the National Emergency Framework in Barbados, there's a Food and General Services Supply Committee that has a plan that collaborates with the merchants, etc., and mandates, at least certainly during the hurricane season, that there is 3 months supply of food in Barbados at any one time. Okay? And if you have to leverage that food, the government then pays the merchants directly for the food to supply to people in homes and so on and shelters. The weakness there, however, is that is predicated upon the same imported foods.
Correct.
And therefore, what we need to move towards is systems where that looks at the region and redundancy in the region so that we can get some of this food in Barbados from Belize or Guyana, as the case may be. So that is basically what we, as a strategic intervention. And we have the example of Cuba, who get hit by hurricanes in some part of Cuba every year, and they have those systems in Cuba. So as part of our technical cooperation agreement that we know that CARICOM is now mapping out with Cuba, this is an area of investment I think that's very important for the region to go forward on. And then we come back to the last year when the CARICOM institutions met to discuss this issue of resilience. And relative to the agriculture sector, there were 3 areas that were identified. One, given that the root crops, yams and cassava, etc., are those that appear most resilient to floods and droughts and hurricanes, that we need to build out those value chains such that we can have those available not only in fresh form, but in other preserved forms to help deal with our food supply.
Correct.
The second area was the area of planting material to allow our farmers to get back into production as quickly as possible, as Jose is alluding to, and that we need to build out those systems. Because a lot of the stuff and things that would help us and things to be food secure are things that we can't, are not seeds that we can import from the United States. But it's the sweet potato slips and the yam cuttings or whatever that we have right here inside the region. And therefore, and the other area is to deal with the issue of big data in the agricultural sector, so that we don't necessarily have to wait till the all clear is given to know what it is we have and what has been damaged and what we need to replace.
All right, Christina, you're going to have the final word because we are out of time and I'm getting signals all around. So.
Well, basically, as a young person and someone getting into, well, I'm still getting into farming, I would say. My biggest concern is that even though we continue to have these meetings, and I haven't been around those many years, but it's the same thing going around every year. You know, people come and say the same things, they focus back on the same things. Everybody seems to be frightened to take the jump to do something different. And that's really what I'd like to implore to you guys to do something different, to do something targeted at youth, because I get interns left, right, and center. My farm is exciting to young people. They are always there. I'm training them, but there's nowhere for them to go. I cannot employ them all. They need the opportunity. They have the skill, but no one's taking them on. And if you really want to see a big difference in agriculture in the sector, you have to start backing the young people. They're the ones that are going to make the change. We're always still focusing on someone who's been farming cassava in the ground for 20 years. You need somebody that's going to go into greenhouse production, someone that is going to go into aquaponics, someone that is going to go into, let's say, cannabis production when it becomes legal, because those are the things that are new and exciting and they become niche markets for the Caribbean. I don't think we're ever going to replace wheat or rice. We're not of that scale, but we can focus and target on niche markets. And tilapia itself in Barbados is a huge niche market. The reason I got into it is not to produce massive amounts of cheap tilapia. It is to produce a sustainable, certifiable product that is a niche market in places like New York, Washington, Europe. Because what Jamaica is doing, they're exporting a certified fillet that is fresh and is flown by plane and it is sold at an extreme price. I think it's €7 per pound. And they can get and make money off of those high-end products. That is why they're exporting. So we need to start looking as well at those niche markets and not just saying that we need to produce volumes of cheap food. We need to see what we as a region can get into that's different and competitive. So.
Thank you so much. We have a presentation to do shortly, which the president and the representative from FAO will do. But before we get to that, all that's left for me to do then is to beg your indulgence and congratulate the panel this evening for what has been an absolutely engaging discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us here this evening. With that, we invite the panel to leave the stage, and we will invite the president and our representative from the Food and Agriculture Organization, Ms. Wata El Kouni, who is the Service Chief for FAO's Investment Center. And we also invite Minister, the Honorable Dean Jonas, from the Minister of Agriculture in Antigua and Barbuda, and also Chairman of CORTED, the agricultural section, to come and receive a presentation of the state of agriculture in the Caribbean. Thank you. Thank you, Minister. So if you could just stay right there. Where's Luther? I thought Luther, you need to come on stage, please. I would also, while the others are getting mic'd up, the next panel is getting mic'd up, I really would like you to put your hands together for Mr. Luther St. Ville, who's done a phenomenal job in really pulling this all together. Excellent. Thank you all very much. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. Please stick around. Our panel, the next panel, is going to start momentarily. And as I said, while they're getting mics, so one bit of housekeeping, a note here. Transportation this evening for the cultural evening leaves the hotel at 7:15, 7:30, and 7:45 to take us to Queen's Hall. The cultural evening starts at 8 p.m. So if you want to be part of it, and you should want to be part of it, it promises to be quite fantastic. We have shuttles at 7:15, 7:30, and 7:45. Thank you so much. Thank you.